Also, welcome to the final session of our legislative seminar, Working for a Living Wage, in which we will hear from Tim Conder of Durham CAN, congregations, associations, and neighborhoods. My name is Sarah Ogletree. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the program coordinator of the North Carolina Council of Churches Eco-Justice Connection program, and also our NC Interfaith Power and Light, NCIPL campaign. I'm joining you today from my home in Western North Carolina on the occupied land of the Cherokee, and I'm grateful to be with you for this time of fellowship, learning, and motivation toward action. At this time, please do, if you have not already, introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to know more about you, the organizations that you represent or belong to, and where you're calling in from. This is also a time to acknowledge the Indigenous communities whose land you call home as we strive to center this call in justice and accountability. Thank you, and we are grateful that you are with us. As I said, today we will be hearing from Tim Conder, and just to give you a bit more information about him, Tim has organized with Durham CAN, a part of the Metro IAF Network, for over 15 years and is currently co-leading its Living Wage Jobs Action team. Tim is also founding pastor of Emmaus Way in Durham, North Carolina, and is currently a founder and co-president of the Black Mountain School of Theology and Community, a school that seeks to enliven congregations and civic organizations by teaching principles of community organizing, action research, and critical theology as tools to enlarge social impact for justice. He recently completed a Ph.D. in cultural studies at UNC Chapel Hill, focusing on North Carolina's NAACP-convened moral movement, with a goal of exploring how leaders negotiate Protestant faith heritages to forge identities as social justice activists. Wow. All of that is so wonderful, Tim. Thank you for the work that you do, for being who you are in this world, and for spending this time with us to help us think about how we can walk more faithfully and love our neighbors more deeply. Lastly, to all of you joining this conversation, thank you for all the conversations you've been to this week. Hopefully you've been able to attend a few, and if this is the first one that you've been able to attend during our legislative seminar, thank you for being here today. And please do put your questions to Tim in the chat as those questions arise for you. We will have a Q&A time, and we do want to emphasize community learning and conversation as a part of our discussion. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the call. We will grab those for that Q&A time. And now I will pass the call to Tim. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. What a delight to be with you folks today. I'm going to just start sharing my screen, and let's see if we can get up to the top here. And there we go. Well, there we go. Great. So what a good time to be with you folks. I've been able to pop in this week and have learned a great deal. And so today we're going to talk a bit about living wages and jobs, and particularly congregational organizing as it relates to those things. And this was well introduced, but I do this as fair warning, is that I'm not really a policy person. My passion is congregational and community and civic organizing. So you're going to hear there'll be policies and there'll be stats and details, but you're going to hear a person who's an obsessive organizer, and my organizing life is multi-placed in terms of the moral movement and Durham CAN and now the Black Mountain School. And so we're going to talk particularly organizing ideas as it relates to living wage. My goal would be to hope that you would walk away from this with some things that you could specifically do in a congregation, small or large, or in a community grouping related to living wages. And who knows, I might even preach a little bit during the middle of this at some point. So who knows? But I wanted to, I was searching the scriptures, and I found a forgotten beatitude that I wanted to mention is, blessed are the, and a good answer to this would be biscuits, because I think most of us all love biscuits at some level. I probably love them too much, but I really mean blessed are the biscuit makers. And I say that because when I first started working with Durham CAN, this must have been around 2005, 2006, and Emmaus Way was a startup congregation, and we were looking for something that would have social impact. My greatest frustration as a pastor, and I have mastered pastorally downward mobility. I think I'm with the best of those because I started in a very large church at 24 and it got smaller and smaller, but I had worked for 20 years in fairly prominent churches with the difficult realization that nothing was different in our communities, despite the presence of those churches. There was no less poor, there was no better transportation, there was no greater equity. The world still was patriarchal and heteronormative and racist and all of those things. And so when the Emmaus Way got started, we wanted to find people who were changing things. And for us, that was Durham CAN. And as we got started, one of the first things that they had done is they had won a living wage action in Durham, so that they had gotten the city of Durham and eventually Durham Public Schools, County of Durham, and then Duke University to all make agreements to pay a living wage. And at that point, I think the decision was somewhere around $11.50 an hour, $12 an hour, which was substantive. It was a move from 7 to above 11. And I was participating in a Christmas Day neighborhood dinner that a bunch of churches in East Durham were throwing and did annually. And I was there kind of doing my thing, schmoozing around, sitting down and eating multiple lunches with people and hearing their stories. And I met the biscuit maker, or a biscuit maker at Duke University, somebody who got up every morning at 4 a.m. and made, fresh biscuits for students in one of their dining halls. And we were just talking, and I asked how things were going. And she said, my life has changed radically in the last month. My salary has gone up from $7.25 an hour to over $11 an hour. And she said, things are challenging. I'm a grandmother. I have I think maybe 5 grandkids that were living with her. And she said, things are tight. It's hard, but $4 an hour is unbelievable. I'm not just buying Christmas presents. We are taking kids to the doctor. We're buying prescription drugs that we need. The decisions in our life are radically changed. And it was one of those little moments where you sit there and say, I didn't do that, but I sure was around some people who did this. And it was so delighted to hear the biscuit makers say something had happened. So blessed are biscuit makers, and blessed are all those who work for well below their value. And all of our lives would be deeply, deeply maligned without their presence in our lives. But let's talk more about living wages and jobs. So just as an introduction, I'm going to do 2 parts. I'm going to start with just what's going on. And I found this is the biggest, reddest font that I have on my PowerPoint of talking about what we live in is really a moral, theological, and political. And it's not a problem to get downright biblical over it. It's an abomination in terms of how wages are expressed in our society, and particularly income inequality as well. So let's jump in a little bit and get some details on that before we get to the organizing side of things. And here are just some quick stats. The North Carolina and federal minimum wage for 2021 is $7.25 an hour. Now I'm old enough where that might sound like that's good, but in reality, it's horrific. At that rate, at a full-time employee, you make $290 a week. And we can all start thinking about how fast $290 goes away, right? And $15,000, which is well below a vastly undercalculated federal poverty line. So there are people raising kids and families on $15,000 a year. And then there's some caveats. If you're under 20, you are able to work for your first 90 days for $4.25 an hour. There's an NC student minimum that says that students that work 20 hours or less can be paid $6.16 an hour. Now, I bet there's a bunch of us who were students paying for things, maybe paying for tuition, paying for your life, perhaps paying for a car that helped you get back and forth from campus, but that's an exception. Tipped workers, the people that often bring us food, are often making $2.13 an hour with their tips that that we may or may not pay for. And if the tips don't cover $7.25 an hour, then they revert to the minimum wage. And then there are exemptions for sub-minimum wages, what they call, it's not the language we probably use, workers with disabilities, and their agricultural and domestic worker exemptions. So there are people in our state and our communities that are also not even making that paltry minimum wage. So stare for a second at those numbers, because they're overwhelmingly low. And we're talking about tens of millions of people who work this way. If you're doing living wage work, living wage job work, there's a couple of common objections that you might hear. The first one I call is the "my dad" objection, because this is something that my dad has said for 25 years related to this to me, which just boggles my mind. But from his perspective, university and high school students dominate things like food service and similar jobs. And so providing them a living wage of, say, $15 an hour, which is a common organizing figure with great groups like Fight for 15 and others, is taxing businesses to pay students. In his mind, your typical kind of minimal wage worker is pre-affluent, somebody who's going to college. They're going to be as if college in some way makes one affluent. But the reality is that 79% of our low-wage workers are non-students. And then this is without factoring in issues of race and gender. Because women, people of color, are vastly overrepresented in underpaid jobs. This is a harsh reality. Even in professional circles, when you hear people say women make 79 cents on the dollar for men, they're usually referring to upper middle class white women. You start extrapolating that for different positionalities, and it gets far, far, far worse. Second common objection is that living wage commitments limit jobs and impose inordinate pressure on small businesses. But there's a great deal of research that debunks that notion that living wage agreements, 15 cities that have been able to pass $15 an hour wage minimums, actually decrease jobs. In reality, there's many, many more realities that are wonderful, that paying people a living wage impacts their productivity, their turnover, and their health. And interestingly, I couldn't pull this statistic up immediately this morning, but I was reading something last week that said that literally a $1 an hour increase in wages, just $1, not a $7 to $15, decreases suicides nationally that are correlated to low income by 27,000 people a year. So when we're talking about a living wage, we're not talking about affluence. We're really talking about life and death for some, and we're certainly talking about the deep, granular details of quality of life. So those are a couple things that if you are doing this work in a church or a community setting or care about it, you might hear those objections. Let's switch here to, well, you know what? I lost my cursor here. Let's see if I can advance this. And let's try to get this up to, I'm sorry, I somehow lost the full screen. So is this okay if we do it this way? Let's talk about a broader issue here, is that living wages is a part of a much broader issue of income and how it exists in America. And let's go through this, because I want to say, as we start thinking about how do we change this, what I'm going to recommend is we're going to have to change systems larger than just what people are paid per hour for their work. Here's something just to start on the minimum wage part, is that the minimum wage has not been changed since 2009. This is the longest period in US history for that to happen, over 11 years. But when you start adjusting for inflation, the peak of the minimum wage, if you use today's dollars, was 1968, when people made roughly $10.54 in today's money for a minimum wage. In 2009, that had dropped to $8.70, and now today, $7.25. So if you are a minimum wage worker working well below a living wage, then you are faced with the fact that your income has steadily decreased over the last 11 years. And I bet we could put in the chat box a million things that the price has gone up of. And so life has gotten more expensive, but wages have become less. Let's see here. Let's consider the US as it compares to other nations. So this is just a simple ratio of our minimum wage to the national median wage. And in the US, that is 0.35. So the minimum wage is roughly 1/3 of the median wage in a society that we already know is beset by income inequality. On that list, note that France, New Zealand, Portugal, Australia, Belgium, the UK, Greece, Canada, the Netherlands, Ireland, Japan, Spain are all ahead of the US, with France at 0.61. So of developed economies, the US is among the worst in terms of the wages that we pay what we would deem our low wage workers. How about this? Let's consider the difference between productivity and compensation. And this is kind of beginning with post-World War II, the baby boom and the expansion of our economy radically after the Depression. Note that until roughly, and we'll come back to this, roughly the Reagan Revolution in 1980, and this kind of advent of what I'm going to call a neoliberal society, and we'll talk about that in a second. But up to about 1980, compensation and productivity grew almost on top of each other in terms of a graph line. But notice in the last 40 years, productivity of our workers has gone up 252%, whereas hourly compensation has only gone up 115%, and it was already almost at 100 in 1980. So productivity has gone up, wages have not. How about, let's consider the 95th percentile of workers. Actually, I missed one slide here. I'm going to try to see if I can get back to full screen again. Unfortunately, the sharing banner is on top of where I need to put this. But considering the 95th percentile of our workers, those people who make in the top 5% of their income has gone up 63.2% since 1980. Since this kind of Reagan Revolution, the supply side economics, whereas the lowest wage earners, the bottom 10%, their income has only gone up 3.3%. But notice that it's only gone up that 3.3% in the last 5 years or so. It's actually been down most of their working lives over the last 40 years. This is the difference in income. How about the top 0.1%? Their income has gone up in real dollars 340.7% since 1980. If you consider the top 1%, their income has gone up 157.8%. Whereas the bottom 90%, and now when you're thinking bottom 90%, you're not thinking of just minimum wage workers, but this is people in middle class, even executive positions. Their income has only gone up 23.9% in 40 years. So America is facing an incredible assault of income inequality, where a very few people are having their income raised unbelievably. They're making more and more money, whereas the vast majority of our society is making barely more, if any at all. And when you consider when our income is raised, that 23.9%, the bottom 90% has only raised their real income in 2 time periods when unemployment was very, very low. One of them was the 90s during the Clinton administration, when the stock market was very, very, very high and there were some real gains in income. And others have been the kind of the tail end of the Obama administration getting out of the Great Recession and the Trump administration, where unemployment was low. These were the only times when incomes have grown in our society. And again, a similar point is that positive wage growth has only occurred in this chart, 1996 to 2001 and 2014 to 2019. So something is really wrong here. That's the point. Something is desperately wrong here, is that people are working, they're more productive, but we are valuing their labor less and less and less, and we're compensating them less and less, while prices and the cost of living, the cost of life has increased. Little surprise that slight increases in income limit health crises, including suicide. So let's do a game real quick. This is a final Jeopardy round. That was the stats portion of today's legislative session, but let's just do a game real quick. And remember, you got to do this in the chat box, and everybody knows Jeopardy, right? You have to answer in the form of a question. And Sarah or Susanna or Elizabeth, I'm going to get you to help me with this. So everybody ready? Here's the Jeopardy question today. What is a single teaching in the Jewish scriptures, the Christian Bible, the Quran, or any faith and ethical text that is starkly violated by the US policy on wages and income inequality? So what is a moral, biblical, Talmud, Quran, Torah, what is a principle that is violated by the state of reality involving compensation? Put your answer in the text box. I'll see if I can follow too.
Tim, can you see these, or would it be helpful for me to read them out?
It would be great for you to read them out. That'd be fantastic.
All right, we've got, what is the year of Jubilee? What is do justice? Love thy neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. What is caring for the poor? What is all of them? What is do unto others?
Fantastic. I had a friend, Mike Broadway, who teaches theology at Shaw Divinity School. He wrote a beautiful piece on us. He said, one of the things that you read from the Hebrew scriptures particularly is that it is a moral offense to God that there is reproductive poverty in a society that claims to be faithful. So if people sometimes have misfortune, but if their misfortune reproduces itself into the next generation and the next generation, hence the Jubilee that was set up, that was the whole point of it, was that poverty was not to be passed on to the kids and the grandkids. And if God's in charge of a society, we don't gain, if I'm clever in some way or whatever I am, and somehow I take advantage of Sarah and Elizabeth and Susanna, and they lose income or land or whatever properties of value, I don't get to keep it forever. I don't get to keep an advantage, but our society works literally on that very principle. Excellent, you guys. I wish I had Jeopardy money to give out, because you obviously won much on that. So let's talk about what can we do about this. This is a moral offense. It is an offense that devalues the lives of our neighbors with real consequences. What can we do? And I want to talk a little bit about organizing possibilities for this. Let's start with legislation. Now, this is not my specialty, but there are two bills that are one in the Senate and one in the House that call for raising the minimum wage in North Carolina from $7.25 to $15 an hour by 2023. Interestingly, it also ends all of those sub-minimum wages that we talked about, and also repeals exemptions for agricultural and domestic workers. So it's a starting point. It's a bill aimed toward, both bills are aimed toward a more just society. But the sharp reality is, living in a state like North Carolina, is that there's not a single Republican sponsor of either of those bills. So at this point, in Republican majorities, it's on very, very shaky ground. But this is something that we in congregations and in civic groups need to do, is we need to express sharp support for both of these bills. Letter writing, communication, they take the call, they write the call down, they care about where the call comes from, and they need to be pushed. We met with Durham CAN with Congressman Price just about a month and a half ago on affordable housing and public housing in the Durham, greater Durham area in his congressional district. And every politician, he's a marvelous person, but he was very much focused in a meta political narrative. And our job as organizers was to substitute that large narrative for a very specific narrative of how people are living in public housing in our area. And that's our job as congregates, as leaders, as voices, to make sure that those who are in our political spaces see the reality. I think I told you guys I'm an ethnographer. My life as a scholar is telling and writing the stories with people about their lives. And we need to do that as organizers. We need for people who are in policy positions to understand that there's nothing abstract about a difference between $7.25 and $15 an hour. That's a double raise for the biscuit maker. And how many biscuit makers do you know? Do you love? How many of us are those things, right? So that's a starting point. Let's talk a little bit about, I just want to use one nerdy word today, is what is the real target to all of this? And I talked a little bit about the Reagan Revolution, 1980 and beyond, is that America's economic system has been captured by this idea called neoliberalism. If you were to use the term liberalism the way it was used 300 years ago, it's basically free markets. And for all of the history of the US, our society, our economy has been built on a free market economy. But what neoliberalism has done in the last 40 years is it's taken the market idea, a market imagination, a market logic. When somebody says, hey, the market will solve our problems, or they say, hey, somebody in business is far better than a clergy person or a person of faith or an organizer or, I don't know, a school teacher. You don't know anything about that. We need business people to solve real serious problems in our society. Now, the humor of that is most of my friends that are school teachers know 1,000 times more about what's happening in our lives. But that's kind of what neoliberalism is, the belief that the market not only will solve our economics, but it will solve every aspect of our lives. So what we've done is we've taken market logic and applied it to everything, which means market logic is competition. Someone wins, someone loses. And it's translated into a logic that the people who are losing in our economy, it's because of their own failures. This definition by Shannon Speed is an excellent one if you had a chance to read that while it was on the screen. But in many ways, the growth of modern organizing has been a reaction to this idea that the market is the solution to our problems. A friend of, I think of the Council of Churches, Gene Nickel, who is a constitutional law professor at UNC, he said this beautifully. We had him in to meet with our strategy team at Durham CAN. So there's about 10 of us in the room, and we had a chance to talk about his new book, The Faces of Poverty in North Carolina. And he's done research on poverty for decades. And somebody asked the question, what has changed in 35 years? And basically, what has neoliberalism done to us? And his answer is this: 35 years ago, you could come up with a congressperson or a leader or a person in power, a civic leader of any political party and say, we need to help the safety net. We need to raise the minimum wage. We need to help with housing. We need to do this whole system of realities and change them. And usually their answer was, you are so right. That does need to happen. We need to care for everybody in our society. We just can't afford it right now. But maybe next year we'll put it in the budget, right? Maybe next year, maybe next year. But they were admitting that it needs to be done. But he said that what's changed in these 35 years is now we've encrusted the belief that helping people who are poor are actually hurting them. And this is this larger system of the vilification of the poor. We've been organizing in Durham Housing Authority. I cannot tell you I mean, I can't even express the conditions that people are living in. And it boggles our mind that we're not thinking, this is my neighbor. I need to get in a car and drive 10 miles down the road and do something about this. The same way as the person who brought me food last night in a restaurant. I didn't ask how much money they're making. So that's Dr. Nichols' point, is that we live in a culture that believes that helping is hurting. And so we've got to, through organizing, craft a different narrative. And the answer is in your Jeopardy answers. All of those Jeopardy answers are the right answer of a moral way of looking at life. If you were to kind of sit down to follow that in an organizing seminar, this is the first 2 minutes. Is we often sit down and say society is organized around 3 large social groupings: the corporate, the government, and the civic sector. We usually say to people, I've already drawn it for you, draw them to scale. And people typically draw a big monstrous corporate sector and then maybe a similar sized government sector. But we live in a world right now where the corporate and the government sector are literally side by side. They're having an intimate conversation with each other. Recent Supreme Court rulings have made the point that the corporate entities are human beings unto themselves. To limit their financial giving to elections or anything else is to limit their free speech. Just like if I shouted, Susanna, you can't speak aloud what your truth is, we basically said, which Susanna would not appreciate, but we basically said we can't say that to corporations. They are unregulated in a sense. That's neoliberalism. And how many times have we seen people, recent governors, recent leaders, go back and forth from the government sector to the corporate sector as if they're almost the same thing? What organizing is and what congregational organizing is, because the civic sector is us. It's congregations, it's civic groups, it's social entities, and there's been a lot of research about why that's getting smaller and smaller. But we have power. And organizing is the civic sector interrupting that conversation between the government and the corporate sector. And when it comes to living wages, imagine this. You could almost write a script. What does the corporate sector say to the government related to living wages? Can't afford this. Oh my gosh, this would cut jobs. This would impinge our ability for our shareholders to be happy. This would really get in the way of the mission of something, something, and something corporation. But what is the mission? It's profit and loss. That was said beautifully in the healthcare seminar yesterday. The mission is, whether even with benevolent people, isn't to care for people. And the government has linked itself to building this corporate sector with the mythology that when it grows, the civic sector grows. We know that's not the case. That's why I showed you all those bar graphs and lines. It's not happening. So we have to organize in a manner that interrupts this conversation. And believe me, living wages will never occur if the government and the corporate sector get to talk to each other. It will not happen. But we can make it happen. And I believe that to the core of my being. These are the things I most want to share with you today. Is number one is the most important. Congregations are powerful. Do not believe, or social groups do not believe that you are not powerful. You are incredibly powerful. I may show an illustration today of radical changes in East and West Baltimore, both with wages, living wage jobs, hiring returning citizens, affordable housing. That work was done. I mean, take a guess. How many congregations do you think there are in Baltimore? Thousands, right? This work was done by 30 congregations, 10 urban congregations and 20 suburban congregations working together. We actually have the power to change these things. But to do it, we have to connect ourselves. We have to be connected, and we have to be connected by common interest and a common moral vision. And so what we've been doing even in this seminar is crafting what is our moral vision for society and raising the point that we actually all have a common interest. That worker who is being paid $7.25 an hour trying to raise a family on $15,000 a year, that person is deeply hurt by our system, but all of us on this call are hurt by that reality as well. So we need to connect. We also need to realize that organizing is going to be about relationships. And this is my bias with organizing, but organizing is about relationships first and foremost. Action will follow relationships, but and digital and social media, things like that can be servants to relationships. But in reality, if we don't build relationships, if we don't listen to stories, if we don't ask for stories, if we don't get out of the enclaves that we're in to hear about reality, nothing will change. I cited an article at the bottom of this slide in The Nation called How to Lose a Union Drive. And this is by Michael Geekin, who was the co-director, national co-director of the IAF for 40 years. And basically, he breaks down what went wrong in Alabama. How did the Amazon workers not be able to unionize themselves? And part of it is they didn't build it relationally, and they didn't do it with stakeholders. So the people who are most impacted by these issues need to be the leaders of the organizing. Their stories need to be the dominant stories. And when that doesn't happen, organizing fails. And finally, in my world of organizing, we say this all the time. Our iron rule is don't do for others what they can do for themselves, because people are capable. They have knowledge, they have intelligences, they have power unto themselves, regardless of their income. And if we help them organize that power, they will win. So organize with, not for. So one of the things that all of us could do with this is say, who am I with? Do I know low-income workers? Do I know minimum wage workers who are being vastly underpaid for their labor? Do I know educators who are making $31,000 with a master's degree in certain places to teach? Am I listening to their stories? This is a starting point to change. Here's a few ideas that work. One is just as an action idea is because the market so dominates our lives, sometimes we have to use the market against the market. In Durham with the Living Wage Project, in Asheville with Just Economics, there's a group in Chapel Hill as well. These are just collectives of people largely coming from congregations who are getting pledges to pay a living wage and to only do business with living wage vendors. And this is something we can all do, creating an accountability list, publish, advertise the people who are willing to pay, go get coffee at a place. You know, every morning, if I go to get coffee, I have a choice of going to a living wage provider and a fair trade coffee provider, or a fair trade coffee provider who is not a living wage provider. So choose the former, choose those, know who they are, pull people together. Where we need to start is in our own organizations and congregations. When we started this with Durham CAN 12 to 15 years ago, many of us going, oh crap, we're not paying $15 an hour. We have to go fix that immediately before we can do this work. But this is one way to use the market against the market. Here's another, and this idea comes from Step Up Durham, who's done some, as you see there, some marvelous work. But we also, in our community development associations related to churches and nonprofits, we can create training initiatives that help people get ready to occupy living wage jobs. In our research in Durham, this is one of the things that's really interesting, is Durham has more jobs than people seeking jobs. So there are more jobs than job seekers, but we have tons and tons of unemployed people. I've done work in Baltimore, so I'm familiar with the figure. The post-industrial collapse of Baltimore, particularly in East and West Baltimore, resulted in 55% unemployment. That's double the unemployment of the Great Depression. In Durham Housing Authority properties, unemployment, and Durham Housing, let's name who that is, 95% of the households are households headed by women of color, 95% plus. It might be 98 or 98%. Their unemployment is above 60%. If that's not something that just sickens you to the core, this is in a town where there are more jobs than job seekers. There should never be something like that. And the problem is the gap between the job seeker and the job provider. And this is one of the spaces where I think we need to do urgent and significant work. I'm going to skip Durham CAN and go to the very end to one of our our sister organizations. And I've mentioned Baltimore for this reason. This was started by 10 churches in the city and 20 churches outside the city, called Turnaround Tuesday. And what they basically did, I'm going to let you hear the story of it. They basically leveraged their power to get anchor institutions like Johns Hopkins Medical, to provide living wage jobs. Their target was returning citizens, because in East and West Baltimore, almost 30% of men had been incarcerated at some point in their career. So these are people that were unable to get jobs. And so they created this amazing training movement where if you do this once a week, an hour and a half in one of 2 local churches, they will guarantee you interviews and ultimately a living wage job if you go through their program. Johns Hopkins has promised 1,000 living wage jobs and have already provided 700 of those 1,000. And they approached them with biblical language. They said to the president of Johns Hopkins, "We need you to be our Nehemiah." His answer was, "I'm not sure I can be your Nehemiah, but I can try and I can find others." And so this has been a jobs movement that is hiring people who don't think that they can get jobs and starting only with living wages. I'm going to switch my screen if I can pull off this magic, and we'll look at a quick interview, and that'll be the last thing we do, and we'll get to questions here. Right.
Like with this.
52-year-old Collie Thomas is trying to find just the right outfit. She's got an interview for a promotion at work.
I'm nervous because I'm excelling. And when you excel, it gets more challenging and more challenging.
Just a few years ago, this would have been a distant dream. Thomas was desperately trying to get any job.
Oh, my goodness. I searched and I searched. I was in the papers. I was on the computers. My girlfriends, they took me to different places to fill out applications.
But time after time, she says she got the same response.
Ms. Thomas, you have a criminal background. Oh, we don't hire people with criminal backgrounds. I felt like, wow, I'm not going to ever get a job.
In 2013, Thomas had returned home to Baltimore after serving 10 years in prison for a murder that she says was domestic violence related.
I knew it was going to be hard for me to get a job. And it was at the beginning, it really was. That's when my daughter told me about Turnaround Tuesday.
Every Tuesday, city residents who have struggled to find employment come to this church basement in East Baltimore.
If you come here and do everything that we ask you to do, we can almost guarantee you a job, but you gotta come.
Turnaround Tuesday is a nonprofit program that helps people who are hard to employ find work, mainly those with criminal records. Since the program began in 2014, co-director Melvin Wilson says it has found jobs for more than 450 Baltimore residents.
There are a lot of people in this community that have been connected to the criminal justice system. We believe that the crimes problem is a jobs problem, and the jobs problem is a crimes problem.
These are the statistics. In the Baltimore neighborhoods where Turnaround Tuesday operates, the incarceration rate is about 4 times higher than the national average. They also have higher than average unemployment. Nearly half of people aged 16 to 64 are not working.
People come home, there's no opportunities for them. Many people have been home and still been out of work for 3 or 4 years. Employers have not opened their arms for ex-offenders to come to work.
Wilson says that once employers run a background check or see gaps in employment indicating a criminal history, they don't want to take what they see as a risk in hiring an ex-offender.
The risk is the label that society has put on folks. That people that have been arrested are lazy, or they're not going to show up on time. They're going to bring conflict to the workplace. They got to be twice as good as everybody else because the expectations are that they're going to fail.
I had to realize I am valuable. Growing up the way I didn't feel valued. I never felt valued. Today, can't nobody beat me.
Terrell Williams is Turnaround Tuesday's other co-director. He leads weekly lessons in workplace social skills.
how to do individual meetings, public-private relationships, what is leadership, how do you handle conflict. Everything that we do is about presentation. When you ask a question or make a comment, you stand up, you give your name. When you think about all the tension and stress that we go through on a daily basis, you better be able to laugh.
Williams says being away from society and labeled a criminal means ex-offenders often lack the confidence and communication skills that are critical in work environments. But the structure of prison can also help them transition to the workplace.
There is data that suggests that people who have been in prison and comes out, they do far better at the entry level. They do far better than people who are just in the community and come and apply for a job, because they are already institutionalized. They are used to taking orders.
I'm a motivator.
I'm going to skip to the very end here just to hear how it works out with our friend.
I'm in from work and I sit in the kitchen. I said, wow. Wow. Because I remember it was times, this emotional. But I remember it was times when I used to sit in my cell, coming home to my home, my own home again. This is what I work hard for.
If you're wondering.
So interestingly, just Terrell Williams, who was featured on that, he was my roommate for years ago in national training, is one of the most powerful organizers. The other thing that they did is the home that she was living in, because affordable housing are what living wage jobs go home to at night. And the early footage that they showed of the vacants in and around Baltimore, they actually have renovated the same 30 churches, over 3,000 properties with another 5,000 on the way. And so there are places in East and West Baltimore now where you can't stand on a corner and not look at a single property that hasn't been renovated, or one that they own that's being ready for renovated. So they're going to have changed 10,000 homes. So she lived in a property that would have been worth about $5,000 as a vacant 10 years ago. Her neighbor's home would only be worth $25,000 because it was by a vacant home. They're worth now about $250,000, which is enough equity to send a kid to college, right? So these things all work together. But I show you that only to show you that that's 30 congregations out of thousands, and what they've been able to do. I mean, they have 1,000 stories of our biscuit maker in Durham. And so anyway, I invite you to any questions, comments there. I bet some of my colleagues here will have better answers than me. The thing I wanted to leave you with is that living wage job creation is possible, particularly if we're organized, and particularly if we own our power. So thank you for letting me join in with you folks today.
Thank you, Tim. That was incredibly powerful. Thank you for calling us to prophetic action, for calling us to live our theology. I appreciated your pulling of biblical justice and saying, let's name some of the ways that our current system is up against what we're called to be in this world, up against love and up against justice and equity. It was incredibly powerful. So I have a ton of questions. If you all have questions, please do drop those in the chat. But I want to start just, you did a great job of talking about the kind of systemic and corporate piece of this, which I think is important for us to think both how we can individually address this problem and how we can address the systemic roots and cause. So one question that we have is, how do we interrupt that corporate government relationship that you named? Because you said, if these folks are talking to each other, we're never going to get a living wage passed. Mm-hmm. So how do we interrupt that and create an economy and an atmosphere in which a living wage is feasible?
That's a great question. And that's actually what we need to be strategically thinking about. Here's the switch of definition, is that we need to add power to our definition of love. Love without power is just sentimentality. I love donuts. I can't make them. yeah, I love the Tar Heels, but I can't make them win, whatever it is, right? It's just sentimental. It's a preference, right? Over other things. But in organizing, what we do is we say we organize power through two ways, through money and through people. And we get a stake in the game. One of our victories in Durham is there's a 20, if you've ever driven on the Durham Freeway by the Durham Bulls Park, if you look off to the right as you're leaving that park, there's 20 acres of blighted land in Hayti, one of the historic Black neighborhoods in the nation. That had been blighted for 25 years. That land was controlled by a multi-billion-dollar corporation that was they had a contract to build affordable housing, but no one noticed. And so as soon as that was done, they were going to build market share housing, which is really expensive now in Durham. We noticed, we organized people, we organized money, and as a result, we forced the city, we forced them to sell that land back to the city for $4 million. We got investors to buy it, and that was the price that they paid for it for 15 years earlier. So that multi-million-dollar corporation held 20 acres in downtown Durham and made not a single cent of profit on that. And that's done by communication, by relationships, telling stories. People in politics and power hate those stories of the truth. Oh my gosh, we sold this land. We didn't hold this corporation accountable. And these are not often bad people that are leading us. I don't want to imply that, but we have the ability to direct our attention to matters of import based on our theology, our conscience, and all of those things. So when we connect as congregations and we can strategize in ways that is astounding. I wish I could talk for 3 hours on that, of how that can be done. But I really want you to believe it can happen in your community, because it can. That's a partial answer. I'm sure maybe somebody else has a better one.
Thank you for that. I believe Sarah's having a little bit of tech problems, but we're going to just move on to our next question.
Great. I wonder why Sarah dropped off my screen. I was nervous.
No worries. She said that there's been some Wi-Fi troubles, but all good. We know that so many in our society are working in the gig economy. How can we help protect these workers and ensure they are cared for?
Could you re-ask that? I warbled out that time.
No problem. We know that so many are working in the gig economy. How can we protect these workers and ensure they are cared for?
Yeah, you know what? I am not an expert on that, but we have to acknowledge that reality that the gig economy is growing dramatically, right? We have this came up in the healthcare seminar, and I would encourage that you listen to that in the sense that we've attached benefits to certain jobs, not all jobs, healthcare, appropriate wages, protection of employees. And so we've got to rethink our mind of what are jobs people are doing and who are doing those jobs. And in some cases, we haven't talked a lot about unionization, but this is absolutely critical, is that we have got to empower workers. I would say in all of the organizing communities that I've been a part of, the Moral Movement, Durham CAN, labor and unions are present, but they're the smallest group. And in some ways, we're looking at 40 to 50 years of the decline, even to the point, I'm an old person. I remember applying for my first supermarket job when I was 16 years old, and I had to sign a piece of paper that said I would not start a union for me to be able to bag groceries at the Winn-Dixie in Matthews, North Carolina. And so in some ways, we have got to understand that collectivization is critical in our society. We've just made the point that congregations are powerful when we connect, but for some reason, we think when two workers talk to each other, this is a threat to the goodness of society. So I think that's going to be part of that. I'm another role at academia that is desperate for unionization.
Thank you. My colleague Michelle asked, my mom, who is an immigrant, still buys the myth that CEOs who make millions of dollars work harder than folks who make minimum wage. How do you start to change the narrative around these conversations?
Yeah.
This is actually a conversation we just had last night, actually.
Oh, Michelle, that's fantastic. I can tell you, I'm not in a life where I'm around many CEOs, but I've encountered a couple of them. We did an action with Sturm Ruger about 5 years ago. It's a gun corporation, and you would have been staggered by the profits that they're making. Their stock goes up every time somebody's killed with a gun. Their sales go up every time somebody's killed with a gun. These are realities that people do not know. Our banks, we did a major action against banks after the 2009 recession to try to get commercial interest lending back to 10%. And one of our actions is we got proxies for the Bank of America shareholder meeting. Now, this is 2009, and Bank of America was not a good citizen, nor were there any others during this time. But their CEO in front of us, and we had brought literally 6 feet of documents of their homeowners trying to renegotiate mortgages and getting no calls. And so we're present in the shareholders meeting, just about 10 of us. And he gets a $15 million bonus in the worst year of the history of that bank. I mean, that bank's profits had plummeted. He's still there. And when we got the floor, we got on the floor and we handed him file by file people that were her customers, his customers, that cannot get an answered call, who are employed, making money, but need to renegotiate their subprime loan that had been lent to them. And so those moments of exposure are absolutely critical, is that we've got to demythologize the fact that, I mean, in a fair society, how much money would a school teacher make? I mean, $100,000 out of school would be maybe good for me, right? And then, I mean, are they less valuable? And what we encountered with the banking industry is that they were making money based on financial products, just on products that they sell to people, whether it produces our part of our economy or not. That is a reality that we've got to communicate. And here's what happened in our organizing with banking. I'll be a little bit negative on this point, is this hurt organizing communities, because Black communities and people of color were affected differently than white communities. And many clergy backed out of that action because they had Wells Fargo, Bank of America vice presidents who were on the chair, head of the session, the deacon board, that sort of thing, and did not want to look at the reality that bad loans were packaged largely to Black communities in America. This was not an accident. And so those are the harsh realities that have to get out and into our pulpits and into our common discourse. That doesn't mean everybody's a bad actor, but the reality of what happens in a corporate setting. I mean, $1 million to be on a board, and the people that I do know that are in those places, they've got to convert to stakeholder economies rather than shareholder economies, because there will be no environment left to walk around in, to eat and breathe, if we don't get out of a shareholder mentality at this point. So Michelle, brilliant question. I hope you have my email, because I want you to tell me what you think needs to happen on this. That's a great question.
Thank you so much, Tim. We are out of time. Thank you so much for your questions, everybody. We're going to end with a closing liturgy. Let us pray. God of peace, you have shown yourself to us as one who demonstrated what true power looks like by refusing to use violence. We are willing to follow your way of peace. God of justice, you have invited us into peacemaking work by showing us that justice is the first ingredient. We are willing to work for your way of justice. God of righteousness, you have provided the means for all creation to flourish when we walk your righteous path. We are willing to be your righteous people. Thank you so much for joining us today and this entire week for our legislative seminar. We are so appreciative, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.